Hi, this is Wade Frazier. This is November 23rd, 2025, 2:08 p.m. So I will continue on this narrative on the hazards of the fringes, pursuing free energy, what we learned, what I learned. So without further ado, I finished the previous video on this, describing Dennis's efforts in Seattle, Washington in 1984-85, which is, to my knowledge, the greatest attempt ever made to bring alternative energy to the American marketplace. And a reader remarked in the comments to my Substack post that linked to the video about the high margin on Dennis Lee's heat pump, the 70% gross margin. So a $10,000 sales price and a $30,000 cost of sales is a $7,000 gross margin, or 70%, which is unheard of for industrial technology like that. But part of the reason for that high margin was because it was a $4,000 tax credit, and it was 4,000 up to a 10,000 sales price. So it was priced accordingly. But again, the savings were so great, it easily paid for itself. So it was definitely worth the price. But the tax credit was part of Dennis's brilliant financial engineering play. So it kind of distorted the margin. But if you just took out the margin, you took out the tax credit, then he sold for $6,000 and had a $3,000 cost of sales, which was a 50% gross margin, which is twice Carrier's 25% gross margin. Carrier is the biggest heat pump manufacturer in the world. My guess is that the gross margin would have settled somewhere around 60%, which is, again, unheard of for equipment like that. And again, it was because it actually saved so much energy and consequently money. Commercial systems did not qualify for Carter's tax credit. And that was one of the reasons Dennis tried to carpet homes with them, was that tax credit. But commercial systems actually had usually much greater demand. The best application for this system was when it had to run 24/7. And if it was supplying big commercial installations, etc., I saw those systems would pay for themselves in a year or two. Yeah, in a year or two, it actually paid for itself. And so over the 30-year expected life, and the only maintenance would ever be replacing the compressor maybe once every decade or two. So the system would pay for itself a dozen times over or more, some crazy number like that. So again, best heating system in the world, which saved more than I mean, it blew away all their heating systems on Earth. One of Dennis's installation techs once told me that the reason why Dennis's system produced such high output in COPs is the compressor. So the pump, the exhaust from the compressor was twice the pressure of air-to-airs. And that high pressure also meant a high temperature. And so again, the exhaust temperature from Dennis's heat pump was about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. From an air-to-air, it's about 100, between 80 and 110, let's say. So it was, again, 100 degrees higher temperature, which and the effect was more than doubling the efficiency, like tripling the efficiency of an air-to-air heat pump. And what happened was the HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, with the acronym HVAC, the textbooks would say that the heat pumps could only produce, or refrigeration systems could only produce 12,000 BTUs per horsepower of compressor, which is also called a ton, which had as an ancient definition of how much it took to melt a ton of ice. But anyway, the textbook said it was 12,000 per 4 horsepower pressure. Well, Dennis had or horse of power, and Dennis had 4 horsepower compressors, but he got 100,000 BTUs, so he got twice as much. Again, back to twice, and so it produced twice as much. But the textbooks said that only 12,000. Well, that was part of the issue. Was that huge evaporator panel broke broke the textbooks. The textbooks didn't really apply to something with that huge evaporator panel, and that's why when Dennis had training schools for installers. An installer actually had to be a Class B refrigeration mechanic for starters, and then they had to go to class for a week, partly to unlearn some of the rules of thumb and stuff that they had been taught and learn in the field, because that huge evaporator just introduced novel constraints that again broke the textbooks. In fact, Dennis's engineer, one of his engineers in Seattle, never got it. He had his mantra, even when he had test data showing 25,000 BTUs of horsepower, he kept parroting the mantra of 12,000. In fact, went on the witness stand and parroted that mantra, and Dennis presented to him his own test, which showed 25,000 BTUs per hour. Yeah, he couldn't believe what his own eyes told him. So this is, unfortunately, this is too common. So the bottom line was that nothing could compete with Dennis's heat pump in the heating business. Gas furnace, oil furnace, electric resistance, or air heat pumps. Dennis would save somewhere between 85% and 70% over these others. It was, again, it's just this awesome numbers that, again, nothing else in the world could do that. And I've linked to it a number of times. I mentioned it. In fact, that this Substack post will link to it. There's a company in Portugal that actually makes Dennis's style heat pump, the big flat plate evaporators. In fact, they advertise 85% savings themselves. Again, consistent with Dennis's heat pump. When I looked at the panels, though, it seems to be an inferior version. It doesn't have as much vanes, so it probably didn't hold as much refrigeration. So it probably didn't have as much output. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see the specs on those systems, but they advertise 85% savings. I've heard mixed reviews on what they do, and hopefully they install it themselves professionally. Again, poor installation can make it not work very well, and so some of the bad mixed reviews might be from that. But again, if you can overcome the installation issues, best in the world by far. So that's a little technical prelude to sort of revisiting some of what I discussed in the past based on the comment. So I've mentioned before in my videos that Betsy, who was the Assistant Attorney General who prosecuted Dennis with her completely fraudulent suit, she hung her entire case on the fact that one man in the state misunderstood one thing that Dennis said. That was supposedly his crime, unintentionally. Again, as she said, it doesn't even matter if Dennis intended to deceive the guy or not. If one person in the state misunderstood one thing, she got Dennis. And then what she did was she held Dennis's customers and John Spickard hostage. Yeah, she was gonna wrap the company up in this huge lawsuit so they couldn't operate and then get the systems installed by the end of 1985, and everybody would be out their tax credit. So again, it was criminal what Betsy did, and she actually came to the office one day hoping to make off with more documents because, Bill stole a bunch that got to her, and she returned them hurriedly when Dennis threatened an FBI probe. But now she wanted to get them legitimately, so she came to. In fact, Dennis sort of baited her. He told her to come into the office and pick up what she wanted. But first, he had her sit in a room with about 15 people, I think, that were like the management of the company. And for an hour, she was on the hot seat while they told her about all the things she had done to ruin their company and how all the lives she had ruined, etc. And she was on the hot seat. In fact, one of them wrote an affidavit eventually how, again, Betsy really wasn't a good psychopath. And so having her nose rubbed in like that was, she didn't sign up for that. And so she quit the Attorney General's office a couple of weeks later. And then when Dennis ran into her on an airplane, which I've mentioned, she basically said, I was just following orders. And she eventually quit. But again, and Betsy was all the psychopaths and criminals I saw sicked on Dennis's company, officials and stuff. Betsy was the best of them, but she got disbarred in 2017 for looting a client's bank account of more than $100,000. That's why I post up her disbarment agreement that she signed. The Attorney General who she worked for, in fact, I just found out as I was writing this, he died in 2023, so I'm going to name him. His name was Ken Eikenberry. So Ken Eikenberry was Attorney General in Washington State at the time. In fact, in 1992, he actually ran for governor and barely lost to a guy named Kenneth Lowry. In fact, I shook Lowry's hand once, but I didn't. I should have thanked him for beating Eikenberry. But anyway, so Dennis later discovered that he gave Eikenberry one of the two worst publicity black eyes that he ever got. Again, Dennis ran a full-page ad in the Seattle Times to describe what has been happening. And Dennis later heard that when Eikenberry ran for governor, again, one of his victims, it was a man who was trying to end homelessness in Seattle. What a crime, huh? And so there were quite a few unused and abandoned buildings in Seattle, and this guy had a proposal to turn those into homeless shelters. And the oligarchy in Washington, Seattle didn't like that, so they sicked Eikenberry and this guy to wipe him out for trying to end homelessness. Yeah, that's how our system works. Well, anyway, this guy like Dennis, he didn't roll over and play dead. And what happened was that when Eikenberry ran for governor, this guy did a pamphlet campaign, tens of thousands of flyers all over the Seattle, all over the Puget Sound area on what a gangster Eikenberry was. And Eikenberry barely lost. And Dennis heard that this guy's pamphlet campaign might be why Eikenberry barely lost. And so Dennis gave the Attorney General one of the two worst black eyes he ever got when he tried to wipe people out. Again, gangster economy, again, the whole thing's a gangster economy. When Betsy quit, though, she was quickly replaced by another consumer protection attorney who kept up the attacks on Dennis for many years. I've seen her lie about Dennis for many years, in interviews and stuff. Yeah, these people just lie. They can just make up stuff, make it up as they go, and lie. And their positions of authority, and the media's stenographers, and Dennis gets smeared. It's how the system works. And again, long before I heard of Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman, I was watching how the media operated and how it just was an attack dog of the elite. Never more apparent than what I saw with Dennis. In fact, that woman who replaced Betsy retired a number of years ago from the Attorney General's office after a long career of being a consumer protection attorney. She teaches law school like Betsy did. Yeah, these are the people who teach our students, train our lawyers. And she's a noted philanthropist, which is, again, philanthropy is a fraud by and large. It's a cover story for gangsters and stuff to become a philanthropist. And I could go on with stories about the so-called philanthropy I've encountered over the years. And so it's typical. Yeah, so Betsy's replacement was, again, there's plenty like them, eager to get their hands bloody to get the blood of the innocent on their hands, and so they can further their careers. In fact, Jesus' critiques the Pharisees, the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, it's timeless. And in fact, that woman who replaced Betsy's replacement also helped Eikenberry run for governor. Fitting, very fitting thing. Actually, during the mayhem in Seattle in 1985, actually a U.S. senator went to Dennis's home to talk and to warn Dennis about what he was up against. In fact, it was very similar to the kind of warning that David Rockefeller gave Dennis, 14 years later when Dennis ran full-page ads in USA Today on free energy technology. Yeah, Rockefeller tried to warn Dennis about what he was up against. It's probably against Rockefeller's people. But anyway, so again, there's the higher levels. Rockefeller was never at the top of the global pyramid of power. He was down a few levels. During 85, also what Dennis did was Dennis he's a genius. He's smarter than me. And so Dennis, again, from the very beginning, he had seen these problems with installations, et cetera, and in his mind, he's always turning over, how can I make these things easier to install? And Dennis came up with a concept called the heat injector, which was basically the unit. So the guts of the system, where it has all the refrigeration, receivers, all the guts of the system, is a box about this big, yay big or so. And Dennis came up with an idea of actually mounting the panels like a fan formation, like this, like 8 panels on top of that box. And again, have again, what if he was able to industrialize it, create an industry, which is that was always Dennis's dream to create an industry out of that. Then you could have a fully manufactured, fully charged system built like that, and then with a big enough truck, you could bring it over to the customer's home and just plop it on their lawn. And it would actually perform probably pretty well. Maybe not as well as something if you had the panels all facing the south, but still probably pretty darn good. And there are other ways to try to overcome installation issues, which Dennis, he was always doing that. So there's also other ways to skin that cat. But Dennis's heat injector was one of his ideas on how you could eliminate installation issues. And in fact, if an industry ever did develop, that would probably a way to go. Again, it's largely unexplored territory. My guess is that it would perform 80% as well as if you had all the systems facing south, some number like that. And but without the installation issues, it'd be cheaper. Again, it'd be much cheaper system. Wouldn't perform, maybe it's perform 80% as well as 70%, some number like that. Be my guess. Anyway, this is largely unexplored territory because it's been wiped out. And again, that company in Portugal is installing them. Looks like they're installing them the old-fashioned way, how Dennis did it. But again, to get all the panels in the sunlight as much as possible, which in Portugal is a good thing, right? All that sun there. So Bill Delp. And so Bill Delp, again, Eichenberry died a couple of years ago. That's why I'm naming him now. Bill Delp died earlier this year. That's why I'm naming him. Betsy, well, Betsy's alive. I won't give her last name. I linked to it. Everybody can, but I won't, for her sake, I won't put her full name on my website as far as it could be hit by a search engine. But people can easily find out what her full name is. Bill Delp, again, the hitman, the hitman that Bonneville Power Administration hired to take out Dennis's company from the inside. Again, Bill's a psychopath. And he actually, again, Bill's a giant. He's like 6'7" or something. And he actually, it was a dirty job. And one of the things that Bill did was he actually slept with some of the women at the company. He would, get women. In fact, I recall one of them was married, and he actually had an affair with her. And actually, he did that as a way to get her to steal documents for him. This is again, Dennis's. I mean, this is Bill's talent. And what Bill also did was he duped. He wasn't able to incite a mutiny, that was his job was. Again, when Dennis was out of town, when Betsy attacked with the big media splash before she even filed the lawsuit, Bill rounded up several people who were his dupes who filed on with his bankruptcy lawsuit because you need to have 5 creditors, but it had to be 5 bona fide creditors. And none of them were bona fide creditors. They were just people that made up stories. And the bankruptcy court accepted it. Again, fraudulently, the bankruptcy court committed fraud in even accepting this suit. The suit is not for people who made up claims out of the thin air. Bankruptcy courts for people who are real creditors, have unpaid invoices for services rendered or goods sold. These people just had stories. Yeah, Bill said he was owed $5,000 in vacation pay, who worked for Dennis 6 weeks. Yeah, again, and $5,000 was the minimum amount the creditor had to have to use the bankruptcy court. So that's why Bill came up with 5,000. Again, totally fraudulent, totally criminal, and the federal courts still were also in on it. And everybody was in on it. Full court press. In fact, as I'll get to a little later, Dennis found out later that the Mormon Financial Empire was actually the biggest investor in the Washington electric companies. And they were probably ultimately behind a lot of what happened. And a generation later, I heard Stephen Greer say that the Mormon Financial Empire was the ringleader of the global elite that suppresses free energy, et cetera. And Mormons also stole our company in Ventura. So when I heard Greer say that in 2004, that was one of my, isn't that interesting moments in my lifetime to hear that. But when Dennis's company was stolen, Dennis is the only person who could make it happen. Dennis, again, a unique talent. And when Dennis got his company stolen, which I'll get into here soon, Bill's job was done. and the company was dead. Dennis was gone. And so Bill left the state, leaving his dupes holding the bag. And they crazily kept waging this lawsuit. Yeah, totally. They had no idea. They were so duped, so idiotic to actually join up with Bill in the first place. And they actually thought that they were somehow going to, I don't know, get a big payday or something. Totally delusional. And in fact, the judge suddenly saw the light and was done. Once the job was done and the company was wiped out, the judge saw the light and he dismissed the case and actually threatened countersuing the petitioners, which I'll get to a little bit more later. Bill actually soon moved to Florida, sunny Florida, where he spent the rest of his life and living in sunny Florida, being paid out for a job well done as a hitman. And in fact, he got businesses going in Florida, hyperbaric chambers, as I recall. And in fact, I linked to it where Bill used his talents to defraud his customers. So he was just a criminal. In fact, he got by on his criminal talents for the rest of his life. And this is how this stuff works. So again, I wouldn't want Bill's afterlife, but yeah, Bill had a good run, killing people and ripping off people and wiping out companies, and this is what people like Bill did. So now I'm going to start with my interest to the scene. So again, this desperate prayer was answered in February of 1986. The next morning, this voice in my head said, move to Seattle, and I did. And 10 days later, I was interviewing Dennis's company. And I interviewed with the controller. In fact, I'm going to give his first name. His name was Clark. So Clark was the controller. And I boiled him over. So again, I came from this background where inventors were heroes, energy innovation and stuff, and I was on fire. And there were really no other contenders for this job once I got done with my interview with Clark. But they were actually in the middle, about to move their facility from the factory where they built those 400 systems, or actually more like 450. They had to move out of their facility, and they got a facility on the south side of Seattle near Boeing Field. And so for 2 weeks, they were busy moving, couldn't talk to me. But as soon as they got settled in, I went into the office and met with Dennis. And in fact, I've written about this a bit, where when I was sitting in the huge cavernous office part of this facility, not knowing what to expect, and Dennis actually walked into the building. And I don't know who he was, but I looked at him, and then he looked at me, and he was looking at me like, "Who are you?" Anyway, that was our first moment that we met, and something was up. Anyway, so it turns out a few minutes later, I'm interviewing with Dennis. And then after about 10 or 15 minutes with Dennis, he brings in his wife, Allison, to talk with me. And in fact, Dennis later said I was shaking in the interview. And I'll buy that. This was, again, the lightning bolt hit me. I was so on fire. I was here with my teenage dreams, etc. I could pursue them. Yeah, I knew that the voice in my head, this is why I told him we were in Seattle. But it was pretty overwhelming. So at the end of the interview, they hired me, and I was hired to reconstruct the accounting records. So my job was to reconstruct the accounting records basically from scratch, from all the source documents, and create financial statements, because they were going to use those to try to maneuver. In fact, Bill's bankruptcy suit, was of course fraudulently allowed to stand, was what strangled Dennis's company in '86. Dennis couldn't maneuver to try to do things to get the company to survive because of this fraudulent bankruptcy suit. Yeah, if you can't kill them, wrap them up in red tape. Yeah, they have many things in their bags of tricks. In fact, Stephen Greer, in his movie The Lost Century, he rattled off those 9 tactics of organized suppression. One of them was legal entanglements. But I could write the book on legal entanglements, which if you'd have told me what was ahead of me, I wouldn't have believed any of it. So that night, though, so the day I met Dennis, that night he spoke at the Seattle Center, with in front of about 1,000 people and several camera crews. And my grandparents lived on Queen Anne Hill, so I walked. So I was able to walk to Seattle Center and watch Dennis's speech. And I'll never forget walking back home with this sort of stun. I was stunned by what Dennis had done, and I was like amazed at what I was walking into. Yeah, Dennis's speech was about taking on the electric companies and producing electricity to compete with the electric companies. Even though Dennis had no idea how he would do it yet, he announced his intention to do that. And as fate would have it, as I was sitting there, and I was sitting way back, not probably in the back third or something of this big opera hall. In front of me, just turned out in front of me was Dennis's Bill Delp's attorney, and Bill Delp's attorney actually heckled Dennis during Dennis's speech about the fraudulent bankruptcy suit. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the same attorney who received the stolen documents that Bill got a hold of, who gave them to Betsy. So yeah, the man had no shame at all. I mean, criminal. No, another criminal attorney. I met too many of those. So I've mentioned that in '82, when I lived with my grandparents, again on Queen Anne Hill, the top of the news hour every night was Whoops, which was the boondoggle of floating billions of dollars of municipal bonds to build these nuclear power plants, and all but one of them got mothballed. Um, and that's what created the energy crisis, which gave Dennis an opportunity to sell his keep up in Washington State. And Dennis's speech was announcing Project Whoopee. And that's Dennis. Yeah, there's nobody else like Dennis. Now, yeah, it was like call Whoopee, and this was his big, announcement. And as I've written and I think spoken of earlier, a Canadian TV station had their camera crew there with other news stations, and about a week later, they had a news segment on Dennis, and it was positive. And in fact, it's the only time I ever saw positive news coverage of Dennis in on TV. Only time. What I also didn't know the day I met Dennis, when Dennis was at the speech there, when he made the speech, he actually had a bodyguard. And again, I mentioned Dennis survived a New Year's Eve murder attempt. Also, his head of sales, his head of the sales department, actually hired this guy as Dennis's bodyguard. In fact, he showed up at Dennis's house one day. Dennis thought this was another guy here there to kill him. This is it. Yeah, but he was there to actually be Dennis's bodyguard. So when Dennis talked to the public, engaged the public, this guy was there. In fact, I eventually had a nice conversation with the guy about a couple months later. Nice guy. Again, definitely bodyguard material. He could have broken me in half. Nice guy. In fact, this guy, as we talked, he actually had a friend who had he had a vapor injection carburetor, got 200 miles a gallon, and it was a station wagon. So yeah, so he was hip. He was hip to what energy innovation faced in the United States. So he wasn't just there for the money. He believed in he understood what Dennis was up against. In fact, during that year, in fact, I think I heard about it. It was that year or the next, where Dennis had heard about another guy in Seattle area who came up with some energy innovation that was going to be a threat to the energy racket there. And he got dragged out of a bar and it was beaten almost to death in an alley in Seattle. Right around. And Dennis heard this and it was like, okay, they play hardball. Yes, this guy almost got murdered for again being thwarting inadvertently the electric company's plans. And again, he was probably like Dennis. He thought they'd love him. Hey, here's some great innovation that's going to save everybody money. Well, that's not the program. The electric companies are trying to sell as much electricity as possible. That's what they do. Anything that really conserves electricity is bad for business. This is again, this is the unstated reality of electric companies. So the next morning I began work the next day. But I was I think I was only one of two people who was hired by the company in 1986. Because again, they had installed the systems and the company was dead in the water. I mean, the customers actually owed millions of dollars in future payments based on energy savings. So there was millions of dollars still to be made. They could have shut the whole company down and just Dennis could have shut it all down and just raked in $2 million or $3 million over the next several years. He could have done that. But anyway, he's trying to make it, he's still trying to get the company make the company survive. And when I started, again, so it was, that was 3 months, almost 3 months after, the end of 85. And there were still several dozen people working at the company when I was there. And I worked for, again, the next 3 months. And it turns out mostly for free. I got 2 paychecks in 3 months. And little did I know I was working for free, but I worked 10-hour days, which was my career. My whole career was like 10 hour, it was like 10-hour days. So I was used to that. And reconstructing the books. Yeah, being a busy little beaver, just reconstructing the books. And I hiked on the weekend with my cousin, and that was my lifetime's best hiking year. Oh, what our bodies can do at age 28. So it was anyway, that was my life's happiest year. From essentially when that voice in my head moved to Seattle till our greatest energy shows a year later. That was my life's happiest year. I was doing what I believed in, even though I was starving. I was doing what I believed in, and it hadn't gotten rough yet. Yeah, all the things I saw in '86 was just prelude. During May of that year, again, so I'd been there 2 months, and the month of May had a number of noteworthy events that are starting to wake me up, wise me up to what was going on. And one of them was that Dennis visited Joe Newman's operation. And Joe Newman was this famous free energy inventor. Joe's dead now, died quite a while back. And he visited Joe's operation and he wanted to ally with Joe, but Joe wasn't having any of it. In fact, Joe, we're talking about 10 years later, when Dennis got me to work for him again briefly, there was a guy in our opera, volunteers. Dennis used a lot of volunteers. And there was a volunteer who actually had worked with Joe just before he came to work for Dennis. And he and Joe actually went hiking one day out next to some stream. And Joe confided to the guy that Joe thought he was the second coming of Christ. And Joe was your Southern Baptist guy. Anyway, yeah, Joe thought he was the second coming, which that's not the only time I've heard free energy inventors think this way. And this is the problem. It traps it, so many hazards and traps to this pursuit. And it can go to people's heads. So yeah, you can actually think you're the second coming or expect to be paid $1 trillion for your invention, these kinds of things. But Dennis came back all full of fire, gave a presentation with a video of Joe Newman's operation and his technology, which may have actually worked. I know a lot of stuff that was much better than what Joe had, but Joe may have been tapping the 0 point field. He may have been. And one evening there in that month of May, I was working 10-hour days, etc. And one evening I was there working late, and Dennis was there, and Dennis actually asked me for a ride home. I know it wasn't too far out of my way. He lived in Bellevue. I lived right across the water in Seattle, so it was pretty close. But anyway, so I said sure. So I drove Dennis home. So this is the first time I really had much of a conversation with Dennis since he hired me. And on the drive over, Dennis proceeded to tell me about his employee who died because of Bill. And I haven't talked about it much. I'll give a brief overview here. But what happened was again, Dennis was sleeping with women. I mean, he was playing Casanova there at the company to get them to commit crimes for him on his behalf. Yeah, this was Bill used whatever worked. And so there was this one woman who worked in the installation department. In fact, she worked under Stan, the engineer who built Dennis's factory, who I believe I mentioned in my previous post on this stuff. Anyway, she was young. She was like 28 years old or something. Yeah, she was my age, maybe a year older or something. And anyway, he had gotten to her, and she was stealing documents on Bill's behalf. So she was helping Bill destroy the company she worked for. And she got found out. And Dennis and Allison, being the kind of people they were, instead of firing her, they said, we're going to send you home with no pay for a couple weeks. And if you keep your nose clean, you can come back. And which means not talking to Bill again, etc. So anyways, they sent her home chastened. And Bill kept trying to call her, he was trying to work on her hard. And what Dennis and Allison didn't know, Dennis and Allison didn't know that. And Dennis and Allison didn't know that she actually had just recently overcome a drug addiction. She wasn't exactly some high flying professional. She was a clerk in the maintenance in this installation department. But she stayed away, stayed away, stayed away. And anyway, at the end, and Bill just kept lying, and he'll never hire her back, fire all this kind of stuff. And this is hard for me to recount. So what happened is that she successfully stayed away from Bill. And the last night of her probation, it turned out to be Halloween. Last night of her probation, Bill showed up to her house with another guy that he duped, one of the dupes on the bankruptcy suit, which was actually a Vietnam vet that Dennis essentially told Bill that this guy was his confidant, which he wasn't, but all of a sudden Bill, like a fly on butter, Bill was all over this guy. I mean, and again, Bill ruined lives. And so this guy became one of Bill's henchmen in what Bill was doing. And so this woman had successfully again avoided Bill, wasn't going to talk to him. She couldn't lose her job. She had a young child, like a 5-year-old daughter that she was caring for. And she was living with her mother actually. So she was not, yeah, she was not high functioning. In fact, her mother, when again, it was Halloween, and so her mother and her daughter had left the house just when they saw Bill arrive with this other guy's henchman with a big bottle of whiskey that they were carrying. Anyway, Bill worked his magic, got into the house, got her drunk. And in fact, she called up one of her friends, also worked for the company, a few hours later, obviously drunk, and she said that Bill had convinced her that Dennis and Alice would never hire her back, and they were mean and liars and stuff, and that she wasn't in a position to steal for Bill anymore. But she asked her friend if she would steal stuff on behalf of Bill. And her friend, she could tell she was drunk and a hard time. She said, "Can I come over?" And she said, "No, I'll be okay. I'm just going to bed now." So anyway, she went to bed. Later, her mother and then her daughter arrived at home, and she was apparently asleep in her room. They didn't disturb her. And the next morning at like 8 a.m., their house got a phone call. It was Allison telling her probation was over and it was time to come back to work. And so the mother was like, "Oh, she'll be so excited to hear it." And with her granddaughter in tow, they go down the hallway and open up the door to her room to tell her that she can go back to work. And they open to a scene where her brains sprayed all over the wall. This woman had killed herself with a gun into her mouth the night before, her despair from what Bill had done. Yeah, and I'm sure her daughter was never the same. Her mother was never the same. In fact, Bill, being Bill, he actually showed up to the funeral, this woman's funeral, and spread the rumor that she had killed herself because Dennis and Allison treated her so badly. And Dennis had no idea. Dennis had no idea what had happened. He just knew he had an employee who was stealing. So she was trying to undermine the company she worked for. They gave her a 2-week probation, and then the mornings they told her to come back. She's dead. She killed herself, and Dennis had no idea. Well, what happened was a week later, the woman's mother came to the office with some other family, and they told Dennis what had happened. And when Dennis understood what Bill had done, that was Dennis's radicalizing moment in his energy pursuit. Yeah, in fact, he wrote an anonymous note to the electric companies and Eikenberry, and it said, "You guys drew first blood." And that thoroughly radicalized Dennis. He was on the warpath. I think that's led to Project Will Be and all the rest of that stuff. So yeah, and anyway, Dennis told me this when I was driving him to Bellevue. I could tell that it had greatly impacted him. That his employee had died because of Bill. Yeah, some of the blood Bill had on his hands. Also, what happened in May was Dennis had his 40th birthday. He was born on May 11th. Anyway, so on May 11th, and I was working, and there was a birthday party in the second floor had this huge room, which they could have social gatherings. That's where he played the Joe Newman tape. In fact, the shareholder meeting was held there a month later. And anyway, and everybody was up there with Dennis's birthday party, and I was working. And so I actually answered the phones. So the phone rang. I picked it up, and it was John Spickard. So John, the guy who owned the finance company in Spokane, and John said, "Hey, I need to speak to Dennis." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. He's having a birthday party right now." And John got angry. He goes, "We are. This is important business stuff. This is not something that the party can wait." And he was angry. So actually, I sort of sort of sheepishly put the phone down and went upstairs, and I said, I think I told Alice, and I said, John's on the phone. He wants to talk to Dennis right now. Anyway, so they ended the party a few minutes later, and Dennis talked to John. So anyway, John was in the middle of having his company stolen as a way to steal Dennis's company. So I have a lot of sympathy for the anger that yeah, he's forgiven for his anger because yeah, his life was coming apart because he got tangled up with Dennis and big guys were taking everybody out. So anyway, that was in early May. Anyway, and then I saw John a month later after his company had been stolen, and he came to the shareholders meeting, and John had this stricken look on his face. It was a look that I would come to eventually know well. In fact, a look that I am sure I wore quite a few times myself. But yeah, when this stuff happened, it's hey, you don't laugh it off. This stuff's not easy. Also in May, I finished my reconstruction effort. So I was done. So it took me about 2 months to reconstruct the record, a little over 2 months to reconstruct the records. And by early June, though, there was only a relative few people working in the company. I was a high-powered professional, let's say. And so so they put me to work doing all sorts of other stuff, accounting kind of work that they need to have done. And so I was still there. So I was still coming into work every day. And in early June, yeah, maybe around June 10th or something, one morning I was in there working at my desk out in this big bullpen area. And Dennis was out of town. He's trying to do some maneuvers to save the company. And Allison wasn't there. And anyway, there was all of a sudden I was working, and then there was these people there were people in the office who I never seen before. I just had my head down and kept working. Well, one of these guys came over and introduced himself to me, and I didn't know who this guy was, and I don't know why he's introducing himself to me. And then Clark, he comes over and he goes, he pulled the guy away from me, and he said, "Yeah, you don't want to talk to Wade." And then he said, "Wade, you should probably go home for the day." He's my boss. I'm like, "Okay, Clark, I guess I'll go home for the day." And I had no idea what was going on. Anyway, so that evening, so I don't know, 6 o'clock or something, I get a phone call at home from Dennis. And Dennis had said that Clark had actually attempted to steal the company. My boss has stealing the company, and it was unsuccessful. And so Clark actually had gotten the locks changed on the facility. And he was going to take over while Dennis was out of town. And the same thing. This is like Betsy and Bill. Wait till Dennis is out of town to do this stuff. But you can't defend the company while he's out of town. And so Dennis got back though, and Dennis again, Clark had zero legal standing to do that, and so Dennis had another locksmith come and change the locks back. And this was on a Friday, that I recall. And on Saturday, about a dozen of us met, 10 to 12 of us met at Dennis's home the next day. And Dennis had talked about what Clark had done and about how there was an effort to steal the company that was happening. It wasn't over. And so, but Dennis gave this vision of what he was hoping the company could be. And I remember though, I was sitting there listening, talk about this, and I was like, where's the part where we get paid? Because we hadn't been paid for months. So anyway, it was tough. Here's all these guys with wives and children, and they're working and they're making no money. They couldn't do it for much longer. fact, I was rapidly running through my yuppie war chest that I accumulated in Los Angeles during those days. And in fact, that Saturday, one of the guys who was there was a guy named Bob, like Bob Vandermoss. And Bob was an inventor. So when Dennis was doing his project with B, etc., he had put out a shingle saying, "Inventors, come here, and I will take your pig to market. You got good stuff, I'll bring it to market." This is what Dennis is, again, this has really been the meaning of Dennis's life for many years, was doing that, trying to get new technologies out into the marketplace. And so MOOP was sort of a cattle call for all inventors to come and bring us your inventions. Well, Bob was in Dennis's stable. So Bob had actually, the facility, Bob had his own section of the facility, which he had all his equipment in and stuff. And Bob had heat storage technology. That's basically what he was onto at the time. To me, it wasn't super great innovation, but he was an inventor. He was the only inventor in Dennis's stable. In fact, I later learned that he was drawing regular paychecks while I was working for free, and Bob was doing essentially nothing. That's another story I'll get to. Bob, though, again, they were going to. It looks like they were going to steal the company, and so this weekend, when Dennis had access to the facility, we rented a big truck, and me and Bob and a couple other guys, we went to the facility and loaded up this huge truck with as much of Bob's equipment as possible, and we took it over east of the mountains to Ellensburg and put it in Stan's barn, where it remained for, I don't know how. In fact, it was still there when Stan died several years later. So yeah, it turned out this is the end of Bob's inventing days with this whole thing. Yeah, many lives were ruined and shattered with all this. But anyway, so I helped them do that. And then Monday morning, I was back to work. Dennis was in the office, and I was busy doing my work. And then turned out Clark, he wasn't doing this by himself. So what happened was the people who sold the shell to Dennis that John Spicker put him in touch with, these guys were grifters. These guys specialized in stealing companies. And there were Mormons. There were all these Mormons who specialized in stealing companies. And Clark, in fact, Clark was hired. When Dennis did the shell deal, he hired Clark to make sure it went down properly. And Clark, instead of doing what he was hired to do, he used his position to steal the company instead. Criminal. I mean, criminal behavior. And so here was my boss, who was you take his mask off and he's this criminal. And it was, and I give an example in the post. It's like, imagine taking your life, going to a bank and putting your life savings into a bank. And the bank, gives you a deposit slip and they say you just deposited $1 million in the bank. And you think you've got your money in the bank, right? Well, then imagine the next year the bank actually, one day you go to withdraw it and the bank says, well, you know what? The branch manager who you signed on with, he didn't fill out the paperwork properly. So that money that you deposited, it's ours now. Not yours anymore, it's our money now. That's essentially what the shell owners had done. They basically said Dennis put his company into the shell company, but they decided they hadn't agreed to issue the shares. Well, if that was the case, then the deal's over. Dennis gets his company back, and they go on their merry way. Except these guys said, no, we're entitled to his company now. Again, just like putting your money in the bank, and the bank just steals your money. But it's called fiduciary fraud in the legal profession. So this is fiduciary fraud these people were engaging in. And Clark was their inside guy. And Clark enlisted the help of our general counsel, his sidekick, a guy named Sam. So Sam and Clark were there guys who are the inside guys trying to steal the company. Yeah, these thieves always need inside people on the inside to help them out. That's how this works. Yeah, betrayal by the people on the inside is how these guys can do what they do. Anyway, that morning, I was sitting there working, and Dennis and Alice were there, and Clark and Sam come into the building in their street clothes. I wore a suit and tie, but first 12 years of my career. And these guys come in their street clothes, and they're trying to get back into their offices to recover incriminating documents they had left there, thinking that they had successfully stolen the company already, which they hadn't. And Dennis actually threw himself in front of the door to Clark's office to say, "You're not coming in this office." It looked like it might have become violent. In fact, anyway, Clark decided not to get violent. He and Sam walked back out of the building. Anyway, that was one of these moments where, it was quite a spectacle to witness for me to see this happen. That was the beginning of my awakening, was really happening right around this time. And John's company had been stolen about 2 weeks earlier. And John's company was stolen by the same people. And again, what they did is, in fact, John, like I did eventually, is like he gave shares of his company and stuff to family and friends to benefit them, to take them on the good ship Lollipop. And they were the inside people that helped these grifters steal John's company. Yes, yeah, your family and friends are the ones who betray you. Their betrayal is what makes it possible for these grifters to do what they do. I learned this the hard way later myself, but this is how this stuff works. And so John had his company stolen. Well, a couple of days later, there was a shareholders meeting to decide whether this was really, was it really Dennis's company or not. And in fact, John arrived with his son. Their company had already been stolen. And in fact, John's 10% stake was used. In fact, they said his was the only legally issued share. So once his company was stolen and they denied Dennis's ownership, then John's ownership was enough to steal Dennis's company. And Dennis showed up with his son. And John, I saw John, and he had this stricken look on his face as he walked through the office. And at the shareholders meeting, so this was like my first big awakening moment was at the shareholders meeting that took place that evening. And about, I don't know, 200 people maybe showed up for this. Most of them were employees. And Dennis had 400 employees at one point at the end of 85. So like 200 of them were still hanging around, and seeing what would happen. And so I'm going to guess 200 people, maybe 250. It was a pretty big crowd. And in fact, I was clerk, so I actually did clerical stuff, logging people in, shareholder, etc. So I kept doing my bean counting and technical work for Dennis to the very end there. In fact, the night before, they actually had me sleep at the facility as like this guard dog, trying to make sure Clark and Sam and his buddies wouldn't try to break in. I look back at that and I'm just wondering how risky that was for me to do that. So I actually slept at the company to try to prevent a break-in. Nobody broke in, thank God. Well, anyway, so the next day was a shareholders meeting, and what happened was it worked out just like they had planned. Where again, stealing John's company was adequate to steal Dennis's company. And there was this moment about 2 hours into this farce of a shareholders meeting. And in fact, the state of Washington sent an official there to witness what had happened. And she seemingly had no problem with what happened. Yeah, everybody was in on it. Stealing Dennis's company was just a fine thing for the state of Washington. And so about 2 hours into it, Dick Southwick was the Mormon ringleader of these grifters. And he had the look down. He had the look like old money banker kind of guy. Wore a black suit, drove a black car. Let's call it satanic, but anyway, he was definitely slick. And anyway, after about 2 hours, Dick took the podium because they had now prevailed, and Dennis's effort to forestall them did not succeed. And Dick said, "We don't need Dennis Lee anymore." And when he said that, in this room, this big cheer went up in the room. And I looked across the room, and it's like all these people were cheering Dennis's stuff with his company. And again, it was obvious his company was being stolen. Again, he's that bank thing. Anybody with an IQ of 50 would have realized that these people were stealing Dennis's company. And there was all this big cheer going up with these people that Dennis had his company stolen. And I looked across, and these are the same people who gave Dennis a standing ovation when he did his whoop-ee speech. They give him a standing ovation. A couple of weeks later, cheers his company is being stolen. This is my first "give us Barabbas" moment. Like the New Testament. I watched this. I watched these people cheering at Dennis having his company stolen. And that was like my first big awakening moment. In fact, Dennis, later the next year, he just said, those people inherited the win. Those people cheering that. That was a big moment for me, was watching these people cheer the theft of Dennis's company. Now, it turned out that it seemed like half of Dennis's employees were Mormon. It's like, in fact, Dennis said, how did that happen? Well, what happened was he hired a few key people, and they were Mormons, because they didn't hire all their friends and family. Next thing Dennis knew, he's surrounded by Mormons. So I don't know if they were cheering because their fellow Mormons are stealing the company or not. I don't know, but I have a feeling they were just cheering whoever could pay them. Again, totally oblivious to reality. I mean, thinking that these thieves are going to somehow rescue the company and save the day or whatever was just, it was stupid to think that. But I watched people sign, and this was the first of many times I saw this kind of behavior by people. In fact, which was this was my early lessons in the primary lesson of my journey, which is personal integrity is the world's scarcest commodity. And I always have and I resisted that lesson every step of the way until I had my nose rubbed in it so many times that I had to finally admit it. That yeah, personal integrity is so scarce in our world, but it's also precious. So it's also a most precious commodity. It's our rarest and most precious commodity is human integrity, personal integrity, which is rooted in love. That's what it's all about is love. So the next morning after, so the day ends with, it's in fact, Clark becomes the new president. So yeah, I can't make this stuff up. So Clark becomes the president of the company he just stole, engineered the theft of. And anyway, we all went home and then that was it. So Dennis left the state almost the next day to try to rebuild the company. Some of the national dealers and stuff. He had a national network of people that he left the country. Went to Chicago first with a guy. In fact, a guy Dennis didn't trust at all, but Dennis tried to make something happen with him. And then eventually moved to Boston soon. Within a month or so, he was in Boston working for one of Dennis's salesmen. In fact, my last paycheck I got was the money that Dennis got from selling the remainder of his inventory to this family in Massachusetts, who was a family of this guy who was one of Dennis's salesmen, who believed in it. In fact, and I'll get into that family in my next post on this stuff. And so Dennis ended up there. In fact, Allison left a few days after Dennis did. In fact, she asked me to come see her. And so I came to her. She said, I'm supposed to be with my husband and my children are too. And so they left. And so then it was about this dozen of us, 10 to a dozen people who were the professionals, really. They became called the loyalists. I call them the loyalists. I think somebody else called them the loyalists. But anyway, so the loyalists were the ones who were like waiting for Dennis to make something happen. And we met once a week for about the next 6 weeks until everybody dropped out except me. No, we weren't getting paid. And Dennis wasn't, again, in retrospect, it was pretty naive to think Dennis was going to make something happen go across the country and all of a sudden make something happen where you can get paid. But anyway, so after 6 weeks, that was it. In fact, I called Dennis after everybody else had dropped out, and I said, Dennis, I still want to be part of what you're doing. I want to help you rebuild. What can I do? Can I move out there, help you out? What do you want me to do? And Dennis actually tried to dissuade me. He said, why don't you just go get a real job? And when I'm ready, you'll hear from me when I'm ready for you. I was like, okay. And what happened was I did look for work for about 2 weeks, and then I couldn't take it anymore. I called Dennis up again. I said, Dennis, I will sleep on the floor to help you rebuild, whatever it takes. I want him over. Dennis said, I trust my God. That God puts people in my way, in my path for reasons. And so you have convinced me that you should be with me. So come on out. So this was in early August. Anyway, so I was my up your war chest. I'd run through it. I moved back in with my grandparents and got a job making $6 an hour at some medical insurance company and worked until I could save up enough gas money, et cetera, to chase Dennis out to Boston. Of course, I ended up doing it at the end of October, which I will get to. And so the loyalists we met, and it was very friendly. So Bob was this old guy. In fact, he was older than my mentor. He was probably he was like 10 years, 12 years older than my mentor it was. And another inventor, and I grew up around inventors. So I always had a soft spot in my heart for inventors. I thought they were heroes. And I remember one night, Bob and I and this other guy who was a marketing guy. In fact, there were only two of the loyalists who stepped down with honor. All the rest of them ultimately betrayed Dennis. Yeah, these are the lessons I was learning. But again, this was probably in late June or mid-June or something. And we went out, I remember we went out to a restaurant and we had a coffee house and we had a conversation leading to the evening. And I heard some stuff and Bob started talking about some of his background. And I didn't know anything about Bob until I was carting his equipment into Stan's barn. And in fact, I heard some of this stuff from Dennis later. That Bob, he was a World War II vet. And after World War II, he got a job at General Motors. And Bob was already an inventor guy. And so what happens is when he worked at GM, they actually used him they said, you're bulletproofing our patents. So what happens, they'd hand him patent applications. And they told him they were theirs. And they basically said, I want you to try to figure out ways around these patents we're giving you as a way to bulletproof them. So the story they gave him was that he would come up with his ways how he could defeat the patents. And then they'd go to and he'd send them on to his attorneys, and then they would do more work to bulletproof the patents. And Bob did this for several years. And after he had done this for several years for General Motors, he found out that those weren't GM patents after all; they were the patents of competitors, etc. So Bob was helping General Motors steal patents from their competitors. And Bob actually still respected GM. He said, "Yeah, they're gangsters, but I respect them." Believe it or not. In fact, during that, I think in the same evening, we were talking about, like high mile per gallon carburetors, like my mentor was working on, how Dennis's bodyguard knew about. And Bob said that when he was working at GM, this is in the late 1940s now, he heard. So he was a GM and he heard this. There was a customer at General Motors who bought a Chevy pickup truck. And he took it home, and the Chevy pickup truck was getting 70 miles a gallon. Well, this guy was the happiest customer on earth. He started telling everybody knew that he was getting 70 miles a gallon with this Chevy pickup truck that he just bought from General Motors. Anyway, GM had somehow inadvertently let one of their prototypes get into circulation, and this guy was the happiest customer on earth. Well, GM immediately contacted the guy and they said, "Oh, you got this prototype that wasn't intended for the public. In fact, it will burn the valves up, etc." And they did everything. They moved heaven and earth to get that truck back. And so Bob's sharing this with me about when he was working at General Motors. And I could go on and on with those kind of stories. Yeah, high mile per gallon carburetors have been around for a century. And in fact, GM, Detroit owns most of the patents. Corporate America owns all the patents. In fact, as my mentor discovered, which I think I mentioned earlier in an earlier post. And the one thing, though, that Bob had discussed with me or told me, which was news to me, it was so up until that moment, I looked at inventors as heroes. They were like, there's heroic people trying to make the world a better place. And Bob said that he had been involved in many inventors groups, several. He'd been involved in several inventors groups, groups of inventors get together to like commiserate and support each other. And Bob said they never worked because every inventor was trying to commandeer the organizations to support his inventor. Yeah, so it's like a wolf pack, and everybody's trying to be the alpha. So I said, yeah, it never worked because every inventor was trying to become the alpha inventor. So yeah, it was a house divided against itself. And said, yeah, it never worked. And that was the first time I heard that. It was like, what? No, anyway, that was like my first inkling of what I was in for. This is again back to losing in my naivete. It was a long, slow process, and I lost it honestly. I just had to have it rubbed in my face enough times, and I go, okay, this is how it works. Scrolling through my post here. So the bankruptcy lawsuit. So when Bill left the state, so literally when Dennis was run out and said his company's stolen, Bill's job was done. The company was essentially dead. It would never do anything productive. So Bill left. In fact, the dupes, he had rounded up these four other people, four other idiots, to engage in this fraudulent bankruptcy with him. They just made up stuff why Dennis owed him all this money. Bill leaves the state, and these people still kept waging the lawsuit. They were human delusions are infinite, and they kept waging the lawsuit. Thinking, I don't know what they thought they were going to get. They thought they were going to get a big payday or something from the stolen company. I don't know. But what happened was that bankruptcy action was strangling the company, so the grifters had to get it dismissed, and so it went to trial. When there were hearings and testimony of these so-called these creditors, these phony creditors, and me and one of the loyalists I became friendly with, in fact, another Mormon, we went to the hearings, and in fact, we also gone to a creditors hearing at the office a few weeks later. In fact, Clark tried to rehire me, and then I had seen what Clark had done, and he was my boss. It was difficult for me to I didn't tell Clark to his face that he was a criminal. In fact, he tried to hire me. I said, I won't do that. But he said, well, can I get you to sign an affidavit to the financial statements you prepared? Today, I probably would have said I would decline that. Back then, he talked me into it. I said, okay, I'll do that. In fact, I went to his law offices where their lawyers were and signed the affidavit with these grifters. And the penthouse office suite, kind of these grifters' lawyers. In fact, at that when I went to that suite, Clark actually showed me a glossy brochure that they had come. They renamed their company Sonos, and they had actually a glossy brochure on the heat pump, etc. Like they were really kind of trying to make a go of it. Which, and I've seen this over and over. Also, it's like Clark had just seen what happened at Dennis's company when the powers that be decided this is too big of a threat to the electric companies. What do you think, that they were going to let him do it? Again, I don't know what's in their minds. I don't know what's going on. If that was part of a further scam, I don't know. It was just, they didn't have a chance. But anyway, so I saw the glossy brochure. Quite often, the thieves actually think they're going to make a go of it. They entranced by the technology. Yeah, it's just, and they think that what happened to Dennis wouldn't happen to them or something. It was just, anyways. A lot of times I didn't know what people were thinking, if anything. It was just, I saw a lot of this stuff. I don't know. Overcome by greed, stupidity. I don't know. But I saw a lot of that over the years. So we went to the bankruptcy hearing held in downtown Seattle there. And anyway, there were other people. So Clark and company weren't the only guys trying to steal the company. I knew like 3 or 4 other attempts to steal Dennis's company. Other people were trying to get something going to steal the company. So, and one of the would-be thieves also attended. I think it was also a creditor. And anyway, and these people were testifying why Dennis owed them so much. But again, they were made of stories. And again, bankruptcy court isn't for people with made up stories. It's for people with bona fide documented claims, like an unpaid invoice for delivered merchandise or services rendered. These people just made stuff up. It was crazy. And so anyway, at a recess during these hearings, and this other loyalists and I were in the audience watching this. There was a recess, and then quickly Clark and Southwick and these other gangsters were huddling on the strategy, at the trial. And then this other guy named Reggie actually tries to join their huddle. Anyway, and they look at him, and they didn't get violent, but they were looking at him like, what the hell are you doing here? So Reggie thought he was actually going to be part of this deal when he wasn't. They had to dissuade, Reggie of his delusions that he was actually going to be part of this big resurrection of the company or something. And again, the judge was in on it. Bill was the hitman who left these dupes to their fate. And I was like, were there any good guys in the room? No, there weren't any. In fact, as we walked out at the end of the hearing that day, we walked out, and I told my buddy, I said, that was like the Sharks versus the Piranha in there. And well, actually, there was more than 2 groups. And there was. It was like the Sharks versus the Piranha versus the Barracudas versus the Crocodiles, as everybody was fighting over the carcass of Dennis's company. Yeah, that was one of my awakening moments, was seeing the spectacle of all these people just battling over the carcass of Dennis's company. Dennis, in fact, again, he left his house. So he had a house. It was his. It was part of the deal when John brought in. Dennis got his free house. Well, not free, but it's part of the deal. So well, Dennis abandoned that also because anyway, Dennis left everything. He left the state with just the clothes on his back. From a $50 million net worth a year earlier. Yeah, this is Dennis's life. And so, yeah, Dennis thought that if he had stayed, the police would find a barrel of heroin in his closet or something. They just, again, Dennis realized that there was no way he was going to be able to prevail against the powers that be in there. Again, plus surviving all of his associates. Yeah, it was just, I've likened it. I've given the analogy of like everybody turned into orcs lusting after the One Ring. In fact, it got much worse when we started pursuing free energy. But I got early views of this in those last days in Seattle. Again, it was just like, who are the honest good guys? I said two people that I know of bowed out with honor. That was it. That was it. Maybe a few others did, but as far as the professional level people, yeah, two bowed out with honor. That's all I saw. Stan, actually, and he lived in Ellensburg, so he stopped coming to the loyalist meetings pretty early on because he lived so far away. And Stan was in it for the money. And he would, again, his Boeing days, et cetera. Again, he's in retirement, so he was there for the money. And he went home and he was waiting for Dennis to make it happen, which I didn't know at the time. Didn't surprise me. So when I eventually became Dennis's partner, the first thing Dennis did was bring Stan out, and start paying Stan. And Stan was there for the money, which became evident later, which I will get to. Let's see here. Anyway, that kind of, so I was almost there, not quite. So by early August, so within 2 months of stealing the company, Clark and Company, their play was over. So I don't know what their thinking was, what they did, but they eventually abandoned that building. And when we took Bob's equipment to Stan's barn, we couldn't get it, we couldn't fit it all in the truck. So some of the filing cabinets and desks and other stuff that was left in the facility, Bob had locked it. And so when Clark and his fellow cronies abandoned the building, Bob called me up and had me accompany him with the police to go to the building to get into the building. And then Bob could see what was left of his stuff that was left in the building. Bob had some hope that it had survived, what hadn't been stolen. So we did. In fact, I sat in the cop car with Bob, and Bob had this stricken look on his face, particularly after. So we got into there, and yeah, that area they had broken into it and ransacked everything. The filing cabinets were ripped open, etc. And Bob had this stricken look on his face that day. A look I would eventually wear, and I came to see many times. I mentioned that Dennis had all these Mormons working for the company. There was Mormons that stole the company. In fact, Dennis later heard that the Mormon Church was the biggest shareholder, biggest investor in the Washington Electric companies. So this sort of maybe explained why Mormons stole the company. Well, what happened was, we'll get to later on, a Mormon also lived there for the steal our company in Ventura. And almost 20 years after the theft in Seattle, I heard Stephen Greer discuss that the Mormon financial empire was a ringleader of the global elite in suppressing free energy and related technologies. And when I heard that, it was just like it was one of the most revealing moments of my lifetime was I heard that, and all of a sudden, all these Mormon thefts of our companies and attacks, etc., made a lot more sense. Yeah, so I believe that. So what happened in Washington State there was definitely the electric companies were protecting their turf from the threat of a superior technology. The Bonneville Power Administration was the ringleader. They're the ones who hired Bill Delp, the hitman. But I also think the global elite were involved at some level. Again, the Mormon financial empire was, if they're the biggest investor in Washington State, and there's all these Mormons stealing the company, etc. I suspect that the Mormon financial empire was involved in what happened also. In fact, they may have been the prime mover behind what happened in Seattle with Dennis. So the global elite were well aware of us in Seattle. Even though we weren't pursuing free energy at the time, they were well aware of it. And again, what happened in Seattle was the greatest effort I'm aware of ever to bring alternative energy to the American marketplace. This was the big one. And yeah, little did I know it at the time. Also in the mayhem of 1985, Dennis later on said, he didn't give me the name, but he said a United States senator was actually went to Dennis's home to warn Dennis about who he was taking on. Yeah. And then, in fact, many years later, David Rockefeller called Dennis at home after Dennis ran a full-page ad in USA Today on free energy technology to also warn Dennis about what he was up against. Rockefeller wasn't near the top of the global financial system, even though the Rockefellers helped wipe out Dennis's manufacturer there in Seattle. So, yeah, it's hard to know all what was going on. By the end of October, hiking season was over, and I saved enough money to chase Dennis to Boston, so I left. And in fact, I left a girlfriend behind. In fact, supernatural. I won't get into all the details, but it was again, I kept my friends kept throwing these supernatural events at me, these events that I had to like deal with. And it was like their final test of me before I chased Dennis out to Boston to see if I was fit for the task. And so I had actually a girlfriend behind who soon ended the relationship. In fact, I drove out of Seattle with tears in my eyes. No, that was my fourth attempt to live in Seattle. And there I was, I had made it, but here I was leaving Seattle once again to chase my teenage dream. That's one of the hardest things I ever did was leave Seattle to chase Dennis. I said, come over. So anyway, and then I visited friends and family in Southern California for a couple of weeks. Got my car worked on with my father. We pulled maintenance on my Pinto wagon, which was towing a trailer. So the few possessions Dennis and Allison had, including her guitar and a bunch of records, I retrieved them from Stan's barn and my Pinto wagon. I put a little U-Haul trailer behind my Pinto and towed that across the United States. And it had it had my most valuable assets and Dennis's and Allison's meager assets. And that's what I towed out to Boston. And I showed up in Boston at 7 a.m. one day after driving 24 hours straight because I didn't want to sleep anywhere on the East Coast, afraid of rest area crime. And so, I was kind of terrified of the East Coast. And when I showed up, Dennis says, "Wait, you're an enigma. I don't know, I don't know why you're here, but I trust my God that He puts people in my path that need to be in my path, and so I trust you're here for a reason. I don't know what it is yet." And Dennis didn't know. In fact, Dennis watched me very carefully around his daughters for a couple of months till he realized that wasn't a problem. Eventually, he became their babysitter and Uncle Wade. But anyway, that was the day I rolled in. In fact, the next day, Dennis and I met with the company, and that's when Dennis got his first free energy dreams, that he was going to do it. And I'll end this post with that because my wild ride was about to begin. So that's all for now.